Good afternoon, everybody. Very nice to see you all here. I'm Dr. Mark Owen-Jones, an Associate Professor of Middle East Studies and expert on digital technology at Hamad bin Khalifa University. And it is my pleasure to welcome you all here to discuss the future of technology, where we'll be talking a little bit about AI and about Web Summit and about tech in the region. Just to say, following our conversation, there will be an opportunity for Q&A, a 20-minute session, and I'll say it now and I'll also say it again at the end. Please, if you think of a question, make sure it's a question and not a comment. I'll remind you again at the end. But, crucially, I would like to introduce our speaker today, Mr. Paddy Cosgrave, CEO and founder of Web Summit, the global tech conference that next year is coming to Qatar for the first time. Paddy, welcome to Education City, the Education City Speaker Series. It's great to have you here.
Thank you very much. Salam kum. It's good to be here. Yeah.
Great. I want to start with a question about AI. I know some people have heard this term a lot, especially this year. But what are your personal views on AI, its benefits and its potential drawbacks?
It's good. It's a good question. I think media is dominated with a lot of hype about AI. The final speakers at Web Summit last year were Professor Noam Chomsky, the kind of father of modern linguistics and cognitive science, and Professor Gary Marcus from NYU, another notable cognitive scientist. And I think it's interesting to listen to them. There's definitely grounds to be certainly excited, but I think there are significant shortcomings of the current approaches. But technology typically progresses in the manner we're currently seeing. There's enormous amounts of hype. The promise amidst all that hype usually is somewhat underwhelming, but there are still nevertheless useful applications and progress. I think if you're particularly interested in the topic, I wouldn't listen to anything I have to say. I'd seek out both those who are incredibly enthusiastic about it and tell you that it's the future and everything's going to change, and seek out those, perhaps like Noam Chomsky, who say, well, we've been here before, we go through these hype cycles, there are limits to the current systems. And I think at this point there's a real wealth of interesting discourse and debate around the subject, and certainly at Web Summit, you'll find dozens of leading experts, especially in February here, talking about is it going to be revolutionary? Is it not? Is it something we should be nervous about? Is it something we should be incredibly positive about? So I don't have massively strong feelings, but you'll find people with very strong feelings speaking at Web Summit.
So you are unwilling to commit to being someone who's very positive about it or necessarily very negative about it?
I think on balance, I'm probably an AI skeptic.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
There are very few of them in the world, but I think that having organized what's become the largest technology conference in the world, if you can believe the Financial Times. I've seen a lot of hype cycles up very close from crypto and now AI. And I think there's always something revolutionary amidst all this hype. But in the case of AI, we've been talking about driverless cars for a decade. And I don't really know about you, but I mean, I think Tesla is amazing, but I still don't trust my Tesla to drive in autopilot. And the same can apply. I think we're only still at level 3 approval. Mercedes is now leading the way, but there's no level 4, level 5 yet, which is quite incredible. So we've been hyping it for 10 years, but we really haven't actually progressed all that much.
Okay. Do you think it's going to happen, though? Driverless cars?
At some point in the future, yeah. We've got driverless Hoovers, so that's at least progress.
Yeah, I have a Rumba, and I'll be honest with you, it does a pretty poor job of cleaning my house.
Oh, no.
Better than me, but still poor. You mentioned driverless cars as an example, but what do you think technology is going to be in 10 years' time? And on that note, is there something you're particularly excited about? I know you said you're a bit of an AI skeptic, but is there a technology that you see as particularly exciting
Well, I think technology and the geographic centers of technology, of science and innovation, is like a pendulum. It's always switching. If you go back 1,000 years and more, the center of mathematics and science was very much in the Middle East. And then you skip forward half a millennium and beyond, much of it is in Western Europe, later the United States. And now I think if you were to believe any of the, I think, quite credible research on the subject, you take the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, which is an incredibly pro-Western, hawkish, militaristic think tank that pumps out reports deeply antagonistic towards China. Even they conclude that China is dominating the rest of the world. I think their last report measures 44 high technology sectors, and it may be 38 or 37 of those sectors. China now has a lead, and in the remaining sectors, it's closing the gap fast. And so, what do I think the biggest change over the next 10 years is? Well, the shift in the world is clearly underway, and that shift is, for the most part, towards China, but it also means that many other places in the world, including the Middle East, including Qatar, are going to become, they are becoming far more important. And that's a 500-year shift. The world is fundamentally changing, and I think right now, certainly in Europe and in the United States, they can't even. There's like a crisis, a great insecurity that this change is happening, and they're actually just trying to stop it. But eventually, they're just going to have to accept that the change is occurring.
I mean, you mentioned Qatar in that case.
Yeah.
Do you see Qatar as occupying sort of a diplomatic role between this sort of east-west pendulum when it comes to sort of competition over who's going to be the next technological?
Yeah, I mean, I come from Ireland, and Ireland is this small 5 million person country on the periphery of a much larger region, which happens to be Europe. And for the last 50 years, it's acted as a gateway in a regional relationship between the United States and Europe. And when I think of Qatar, I see it more as a gateway between East and West. It's not just a regional gateway, which Ireland has been, but I think the possibility, the role oftentimes that smaller countries have played, they're kind of neutral, friends with everybody, and a bridge to everywhere. And that's where I see the opportunity.
Is this sort of a tangible product that people could relate to, do you think, that could come out of China soon? Or is there something that they're specifically better at? Pretty much self-driving cars.
Pretty much everything.
Really?
Yeah, well, for me, I think one of the most interesting sectors, I always think it's interesting to look at a statistic called net exports. So those are, you look at a sector and you look at how much of it drives actual true exports. To simplify it, it's net exports, so it's imports, exports minus imports. Many of the core or important sectors in the United States have been very hollowed out because they've outsourced vast amounts of their, let's take manufacturing to begin with. But in aerospace, they haven't as much, partly because of national security constraints, they say. So they keep much of the supply chains internal to the United States. That means that aerospace is an incredibly important net export sector. Boeing leads the way, but there are many other companies which we're all familiar with. Okay, so what's happening in China? A number of months ago, the first official commercial flight between Beijing and Shanghai took place with a COMAC plane. What's COMAC? COMAC is the rival to Boeing and Airbus. They've got the C919. They have another model as well. And in time, not right now, but over the next 10 years, they will become one of the most important companies in the world. And you look at the amount of money that China currently spends on importing both Boeing, Airbus, to a lesser extent Embraer aircraft, and that's going to change dramatically. All of the initial demand will come from inside of China. Last week, COMAC signed a big deal with a Chinese airline. Those deals will only increase, and in time, you'll begin to see Chinese aircraft appearing all over the world. And that's a major challenge to the US's most important net export sector, which remains aerospace.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
That's a really
Not
interesting
just
example. Yeah.
the US doesn't just export civilian aircraft. Probably not aware of that, but
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously the state plays a big role in facilitating or creating a tech culture.
say that again. Sorry.
Like the state itself,
Sure.
whether it's the Chinese government or the American government,
Yeah.
play a big role in shaping or facilitating technology industries.
Yeah.
But what about entrepreneurs? I mean, you're an entrepreneur, a tech entrepreneur. What can be done, or what is being done, would you say, to empower entrepreneurs, right, who want to do something in technology?
Yeah, I mean, my views, I think, are maybe somewhat different oftentimes to what's in vogue. I feel very strongly that historically the public sector drives innovation, the private sector drives commercialization. Well, how might you explain that? I think you take some historical examples. You look at the United States. You can take the iPhone. I'm just seeing some people holding up some iPhones. If you look at all of the core components within the first generation iPhone, with no exceptions, every one of those components emerged from a publicly funded research process. These weren't inventions of the private sector. The private sector commercialized them, and in this case, Apple and Steve Jobs made an incredible success of it. But without the state, there is ultimately no innovation. So there has to be a partnership between the state and between the private sector. And I think that's always been the case. I'm sure you can find a small number of examples of true innovation that happened in some private sector laboratory, but they're incredibly small numbers of examples. And so still to this day, you take aerospace, the vast amounts of R&D internal to Boeing or Lockheed Martin or Raytheon or GE are still coming from the state. And without the state, both as the underwriter of long-term R&D and also in the case of the United States, the first purchaser of nascent technology. What's nascent technology? Well, anytime there's a new development in jet engine technology, radar technology, the first buyer is the US military. Oftentimes the US military actually doesn't just buy something they find interesting, they demand the companies come up with something interesting and they're prepared to pay incredible amounts of money. So today when I flew into Doha on a modified American bomber. That's what those planes are. In the case of China, they're skipping for the most part, building the bombers first. They're just building civilian aircraft for the most part. But they are also building military technology as well. And when something commercially viable emerges, it could be the 7th generation new jet engine technology. It becomes commercialized and it becomes sold to the world. And I think that's often forgotten. There's a lot of emphasis on the role of the individual, and it's all up to you. I just don't believe it is. Right. It's a partnership between you and between a state, and you have to have a strong state. It's been a passion project of the United States in particular to go around the world lecturing other countries, telling their governments to get out of the way, simply because that suits the US interests, to reduce the power of the state in other countries. I mean, look, if you were the dominant country in the world, you tell all the other countries, you don't need a strong government, just leave it up to the private sector. Not really your private sector. By private sector, we just mean American companies making all the profits out of your country. And so that's kind of my basic thesis.
Well, I think it's important to recognize the role. I think, as you mentioned, there is a tendency to focus maybe on the Steve Jobs, the Elon Musks, as these kind of charismatic maverick individuals that come out of nowhere and make a product. Is there any truth to that at all, do you think, in that visionary nature? Even yourself as someone who now runs the world's largest website.
I don't think so, because I think the majority of employment is driven by SMBs. It's small, medium-sized, still often innovative, export-focused companies. It's much easier for the media to write a compelling story or for a scriptwriter to create a movie about a single character who's built a defining company of a generation. But that company might still only employ 100,000 people. I mean, that's in the context of the United States, that's essentially almost no one. And what drives most net new job creation is not large companies, it's newer, smaller companies. Right. And I think I think it's seductive to read about these outliers,
Sure.
but you just won't learn an awful lot from studying these kind of, outliers. It's fascinating to read about them. Sometimes they're compelling because they're complex, destructive characters, and there's a lot of drama, and you can kind of relate to that. But those companies are not the backbone of an economy. The backbone of an economy is actually small to medium-sized businesses and startups.
So if there's a positive message to any potential tech entrepreneurs, do you have one, or at least any form of encouragement that you could give?
You don't have to build a company that's worth $100 billion.
Right.
I mean, there's only been, in the last 30 years, it's like 20 companies in the world have been created of that size.
Yeah,
It's something like 11 in America, 9 in China, something like that. I think it's a success if you build a company and it employs 50 people 5 years from now. That's an incredible success, and that's a really positive net contributor to the economy. And I think we should be prepared to celebrate the types of entrepreneurs and the types of employees working in companies that are the backbone of an economy.
I think that's a really positive message as well, because I think sometimes if you have these billionaires like again Musk, Zuckerberg, Steve Jobs, it's not an unrealistic aspiration. People can aspire to what they want, but at the same time, it almost overlooks the fact, as you said, that the backbone are these small, medium-sized enterprises that employ a lot of people. So I think it's a really encouraging message. But there's also drawbacks of tech. As a potential AI skeptic and maybe digital skeptic, then, what challenges do you see, especially when it comes to hot-button issues like cybersecurity, data privacy? What are the big challenges you see in those two areas in particular, and any other challenges that you see that relate to those?
Yeah, it's a great question, and Europe has its own approach with the introduction of GDPR, and that was really about giving citizens protections against large predatory private companies. From my point of view, I think that the legislation behind GDPR is well informed. I think it's unacceptable for large private companies to misuse our personal data, and I think GDPR has, in Europe at least, has been copied in other parts of the world, and I think it's kind of useful progress.
Yeah.
I'm not a great believer in fake news, though.
No. How do we know, though?
Yeah.
But so in terms of privacy, and what about cybersecurity? Like, do you see any? I mean, people talk now of cyber conflict. We talk about hacking, infrastructural vulnerabilities. Do you see this as a big and important element of a tech future that we have to be concerned about?
Yeah, I think the only thing that we know about cybersecurity at a global scale, for sure, based on disclosures from US whistleblowers, is that the most pernicious surveillance state in the world is the United States. You can have an argument whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I don't think it's a great thing, but who am I to say? And then on the other side, you have companies emerging like Huawei, for example. And Huawei, I think, from my perspective, has been largely mistreated, in particular by Western media, because Huawei is a truly innovative company. If you look at the amount of money they spent on R&D on 5G technologies, it's more than all of the investment of every Western company focused on 5G technology combined. Okay, so Huawei spent the most money, more than everybody else combined, and they beat all the kind of Western companies. And then there's a traditional playbook when it comes to dealing not necessarily with China, but if you look historically at any country outside of the West where companies have outcompeted Western companies, there's a rhetoric that's used, and it's oftentimes national security or state interference. In the early 1980s, Japanese car companies started to outcompete American car companies. Why? Their engine technology was better, and so they were able to produce more fuel-efficient cars. The United States reacted to the fact that their car companies were now less competitive. They were producing crap cars that were too expensive, and Japanese imports into the United States, namely Toyota, were winning. So the US government said that there was state interference in Japan, and they put 400% tariffs on Toyota cars. And Toyota diversified at the time into the Middle East and elsewhere, and became the world's, at a certain point, most successful car company. By the end of the 1980s, there were other sectors where Japan was beginning to outcompete the United States. And namely, one very good example was supercomputers. So NEC, it's a Japanese company, were producing supercomputers that were superior and cheaper than the US equivalent, which was Cray Supercomputers, which is now a subsidiary of IBM. So NOAA, the National Meteorological Agency of the United States, decided through a tendering process that they would purchase an NEC supercomputer. And this sent sort of shockwaves through the United States that a US company was being fairly outcompeted by a Japanese technology company. And so the White House intervened, and they said on the grounds of national security that NEC was possibly creating backdoors in their technology and allowing Japan to spy on the US. And as a consequence, NEC supercomputers were banned from the United States. And you can maybe check on your phones, but I think that ban may still be in place to this day. I'm giving these examples just to say that this is the kind of, to me, it's a very understandable playbook. If you have the biggest baseball bat in the world and you get, somebody starts out-competing you, well, you just bring the baseball bat to the party and you just start demanding that people ban NEC or Toyota or more recently Huawei. But I don't think you have to see through the rhetoric. I don't really believe there's much to fear from Huawei. I mean, I could be wrong, but the conclusions of most security agencies, certainly in Europe, is that there is no credible threat posed by Huawei. And in fact, it's just better technology that happens to be cheaper. And I think on those grounds that companies like Huawei should be embraced.
Right, so there is a politicization of the cybersecurity discourse within this,
this
East-West paradigm.
You said it much more succinctly, but that,
we need the examples, but I think that's, when we're talking about the future of cybersecurity, it's a really important thing to bear in mind. I mean, I remember when the UK had to withdraw the Huawei contracts because of this narrative, right? Yeah. So it's interesting to hear that perspective. Yeah. But as time goes on, I want to talk now about Web Summit in Qatar.
Sure.
Okay?
Yeah.
So it's next year.
Yeah.
And before we talk about why you chose Qatar, I'd like to know, is there any initiatives as part of the Web Summit, especially with regards to social impact, that you're proud of?
Well, there are definitely a number, but at the end of the day, we just organize, a tech conference, and if we increase participation of some group, it's still minor sometimes compared to the, larger challenges. I remember about, 8 or 9 years ago, when Web Summit was very young and very small, there was one very stark difference, and that was participation of women in general at technology conferences. It was probably 90% male at the time, and so we introduced a program to try and change that ratio, maybe to 20, 80, maybe 30, 70%. And we've persisted at it, and it's taken a long time. We've eventually got to kind of over 40%, and I think 2 years ago was the first time we managed to push participation at Web Summit in Lisbon to effectively parity, 50% between men and women. We run different kind of initiatives. Carolyn, who's sitting up there, is in charge of community, and she's been spearheading the program for a number of years. We also, I think it's very important to try and inspire, the next generation. Oftentimes those are university students. Right. They can't normally afford to participate in an event of this nature. And so we run kind of a scholar program in a few different guises to enable students to participate. Those students are not just from the local ecosystem, but oftentimes travel from dozens of countries around the world. And they have an interest in entrepreneurship. They're not all doing computer science. A lot of them are studying computer science and related subjects. And those are some of the programs.
I mean, 10 years and you've gone from, say, 10% representation of women to almost 50.
Yeah.
How do you do that? Or how is it done?
Well, Carolyn is really the best person to ask, but I think it's a few different ways. We obviously work with lots of different organizations.
Yeah.
We make it for a period of time cheaper. We subsidize tickets for female executives and female entrepreneurs. And bear in mind, they're coming from nearly 150 countries around the world. So these are women starting companies, building companies from everywhere, literally everywhere. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
Something to be proud of for sure. So, big question now.
Yeah.
What factors led to the decision to host Web Summit in Qatar? And how do you see it contributing to the global tech community? I know you mentioned as well, like Qatar as a gateway.
Yeah. Well, first of all, to work back from that, I think it's very important when you, for us, organizing a large gathering in technology, that we want to be global. Any location that you pick needs in and of itself to be a gateway. It has to be very open, very open-minded. It has to have the infrastructure, airports, hotels, venues, and Qatar has absolutely all of that. But in addition to that, I think over the last half a decade at Web Summit in Lisbon, we noticed a significant change from very limited participation from the Middle East and from Qatar to some of our most important partners being from Qatar, participation from Qatar increasing quite steadily. And I think all of this added together made it an easy decision to make. And there were other countries in the region, some somewhat bigger, some that are neighbors who did pursue us as well. And I don't know, I also come from a small country with big neighbors. And I don't know, in Europe, when we made the decision to go to Portugal, it was dismissed by the media. That's ridiculous. It's not a major power. You should go to one of the more serious cities. But we saw something there, and maybe that's some factor as well. I think it's also a country that, similar to Portugal, I think has great relationships with all other countries. It prides itself, in my understanding, in finding a common language and a common path with all its neighbors, and also with the wider world as well.
So small states unite. Small states, big ambitions. Yeah, I feel that. Are there any specific technological developments or advancements in the Middle East that you think are worthy of note?
It's a good question. I think it's the ingredients, the primary ingredients ultimately of behind long-term economic development and innovation is a function of demography. It's kind of population. I'll come back to that in a second. And education. So if you happen to have a very overwhelmingly young population and they're increasingly educated, after that, I think the role of the state is to help foster opportunity. But you don't need to, those are the core underlying ingredients. And there are places in the world where they either have neither of those ingredients or they only have one. But when you add a young population that's highly educated together, you combine it with a very open country that's welcoming, you are creating, I think, a melting pot for huge opportunity. Predicting exactly in what sector, the interesting companies are going to begin to, bubble up is quite difficult. In the case of China and the United States, they just make huge bets in a huge number of areas, not knowing which area or areas out of 30 or 40 are ultimately going to bear fruit. These things are, there are people paid huge amounts of money to try and make these bets, and they're venture capitalists and they get it wrong constantly. But they make enough bets that some of those bets hopefully pay off, and I think that's probably no different here.
I mean, this idea of having a large youth population, I can see that being a real positive for technological change. But likewise, do you see any challenges that are unique to the region, or even not necessarily unique, but unique in the context of the globe that are prevalent in the Middle East?
I don't know. I think the the hardest challenge will be to walk a line between the rise of the East, these huge powers, India and China on one side, and the, I don't want to say decline, but certainly flatlining of Europe and North America. Because I think the old bloc are being a bit pushy, saying you have to pick a side. The new guys are saying, you know, we don't really mind. Everybody just wants to do business with each other. And I think the challenge for to remain a gateway open to everyone is to, with great diplomacy, walk that line and stay friends with everyone. And of course, not forget South America, Africa, and Southeast Asia as well. These are still, you know, huge markets with huge upside. And I think so far, you know, Qatar is doing an incredible job in all of these regions.
That's great. And my final question before I open it to the floor, just, are you, I mean, I'm guessing you'll be spending a bit more time in Qatar and the Middle East generally. Are you aware of any sort of projects or incentives that are helping people get into tech or startups or tech projects?
Yeah, well, I've seen some of the, I saw, you know, a campus yesterday and today, the same one. And I'm aware, you know, of a lot of conversations from the people, you know, I interact with who are thinking a year, 2 years, 5 years, you know, ahead of time in terms of, you know, what are the best policies to implement to, you know, help people start companies faster than ever before, attract more of the best talent from around the world to Qatar. And that impresses me more than anything else. It's the mindset, I think, of those in positions of influence and power is just amazing. And that will be a huge determining factor, I think, in the success of the country in the medium term.
So encouraging talent. And it makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Paddy, thank you so much for indulging my questions. I'd like to open up now to the floor. So if any of you have got a question, it would be great if you could ask it. And I will remind you, as I said before, please keep it a question. And depending on the length of your question, I might take a couple at a time and then hand them over to Paddy. Okay? So if you've got a question, if you could please raise your hand. The microphone will be coming to you.
Thank you so much, Paddy, for the amazing insights. There's a lot of excitement about having Web Summit come to the region for the first time. I'm curious to know what are your plans to kind of contextualize some of these conversations and themes to fit the region and the language as well, because there's a lot of conversations about AI in Arabic and a lot of other things that are relevant to the region. Yeah,
those are, you know, great questions and something we're thinking a lot about from a you know, language point of view. There will be simultaneous translations. Of course, some of those on stage will, you know, may speak Arabic. We've some Chinese speakers that will likely neither speak Arabic or English, and we'll hopefully be able to provide translations for that as well. We already do that inside of our mobile app, so you don't need any of the clunky kind of old school translation headsets. In addition to that, you know, I hope that the event becomes a platform for some of the most exciting early stage companies to speak and to present alongside, you know, companies that may be, you know, at this point far more successful than them. So in ways, hopefully it gives a leg up to companies from Qatar, from the region, that might not ordinarily get to speak alongside such maybe established startups or fast-growing startups. And then we have a whole set of programs for local startups to try and help them as best as possible get the most out of Web Summit. So those programs, there's a program called Alpha, which is for the earliest stage startups. Beta is for just startups that are maybe beyond a kind of a seed stage. And then we have a program called Growth, which is for companies that really have a product market fit and they're beginning to really scale. But I'd love to talk to you afterwards about it. Thank you.
There was a gentleman in the third row, I believe. Yes. Yeah, there's a mic coming to your left here. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the talk. I'd like to ask what do you see for the region in general and Qatar specifically in this era where we have the decline of some countries or the flattening of them on the east side and the rise of other countries on the east side, sorry, the west and the east. So what role these countries can play in the next period? Thank you.
It's a great question. I'm no expert whatsoever. I just think, there's a huge opportunity for the region. You think about where it's located globally. I think you have to re-look at the map and think about it as the center of the world, because you travel essentially kind of 6 hours anywhere. And that's, is that where maybe 3/4 of the world's population are actually located? And I think Qatar should really consider itself more so the center of the world than it maybe has done. I also see great opportunity in terms of the increasing alliances within the region. I personally think that the British and the Americans, I'm Irish, so we just talk openly about the British, they did a very good job of pursuing their interests by keeping those in other parts of the world a little bit divided and at each other, as opposed to focused on the bigger opportunity of coming together, of trading together, of ensuring diplomatic relationships are formalized and peaceful. And so I think the region in general, there's a huge century of opportunity, and that's brought about by increasing coalition and partnership across the region. And that has not been the case as much so anyway over the previous 50 years, 100 years. That can only be a good thing, I think.
Yeah. Great. Could you raise your hand, please, if you have the question? There's a woman at the back. Yeah, a microphone's coming to you, and there's someone else had their hand up on this side.
Sorry. I want to ask about how Web Summit will help the young people in Qatar or around the world.
Yeah, that's a great question. I maybe can elaborate a little bit on our scholarship program, our student program.
Sure. Great.
There are two primary programs where we help provide an opportunity for students who, of course, by the nature of what they're doing, aren't earning and may not have the resources to be able to either travel or participate in a conference like Web Summit. The first program we run, we encourage students, usually they come for Web Summit in Lisbon, about 70 countries around the world, and they work for a day at Web Summit. They could be helping speakers or helping investors or helping startups. It gives them real first-hand exposure to people in the ecosystem. And in return, then they get a full ticket for 2 days to attend the event at no additional cost. And the other program we run targets somewhat more master's level and PhD level students, in particular in computer science, who may be, again, not in a financial position to participate. They apply, we may give them a scholarship to attend the event. And their presence is of great interest, I think, to many of the companies, because many of these young companies are giving opportunities to young computer science graduates and engineers to get in on the kind of bottom floor of these high growth startups. So those are two of the ways. And then for those groups, we also run some specific programs before the event and during the event to try and help them get the most out of the event as well. So I hope that helps. And if you've any further questions, please feel free to reach out to me and Carolyn as well.
We've got a couple of questions. The microphone's, I think, still near the back, so there's a lady there, just to your left. Yeah, and then we'll come down a bit, and then move on to the right as well. I saw that hand up there.
Hello, everyone. First of all, thank you to Paddy for coming to Qatar and giving such an amazing, insightful talk. So considering the future of technology and there are a lot of amazing tech solutions and entrepreneurs coming forth. But one thing that is big at stake, especially that is a concern for Qatar as well and its vision of 2030, is the sustainability factor. So how do you think the future of technology, especially in the era of AI, can potentially impact sustainability and also reduce the environmental footprint in the future? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm absolutely it's incredibly important. I'm absolutely no expert on these matters. For the last 8 years within Web Summit, we have run a dedicated conference on the SDGs. It's called Planet Tech. It may be of particular kind of interest to you, and we will have speakers from all over the world that are experts in this specific area, and both educating people around what is being done that is working, and what may be done that isn't working, and what should be done that hasn't been done yet. So hopefully Planet Tech within the event may be of particular interest to you, but it's a very important issue, and thank you.
Fantastic. We have a question here. Down in the middle, yes, thank you. And then we'll move across.
Thank you very much. I want to ask, in this Web Summit, they will discuss the challenges that facing because of the technology, like cyberbullying, challenges that relate to how to protect the children, protect the family, these issues that, different solution to how to control even some information in the web to support or to protect our children.
Yeah, it's a great question. I have a 6-month-old boy and a 6-year-old son who keeps telling me, he's turning 7 next week, that he should get an iPhone for his 7th birthday, which there's just no way he's getting an iPhone or a phone. But one day he will, and it's something I already worry about. Within Web Summit itself, we often have the executives leading what's oftentimes called safety from some of the major online social media platforms that I think are the primary playgrounds within which a lot of kind of cyberbullying occurs. And I think I shouldn't say, but I think some companies are doing probably better jobs than others. I've talked publicly before about TikTok, for example. I think they are actually, despite being perhaps the newest platform, are perhaps doing the best job. And some of their team from around the world will be here in February. They're a partner as well. But hopefully we'll also hear from those in charge of that vital role from some of the other platforms as well, because I don't think we've in any way solved the issues, and it requires a continuous kind of dialogue.
Great. So you'll have someone from TikTok, hopefully, at
Yeah.
Web Summit?
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
There was a question here at the front. Yeah, it's coming up from the other side.
Hello, Paddy. Thank you for being here. Thank you for organizing such insightful talks. As an AI skeptic, and thank you for being so straightforward about your opinions regarding cybersecurity and other matters. I wanted to know what is your perspective toward drone-based services? And yeah, that's it.
Yeah, great question. I think there are definitely some very compelling examples of drone-based technology. There's a former Googler called Mark Rober, who has a recent sort of almost mini documentary on a drone company based for the most part in Africa, helping deliver vital medicines and blood to locations that are incredibly difficult to reach. And it's quite amazing. It's about 20 minutes, and maybe you've seen it. I think it's fantastic. With all of these technologies, it's just a matter of figuring out the use cases as those technologies develop. And there's another company that comes regularly to our events called Skycatch, and they specialize in really kind of industrial grade technology, helping large mining companies create, millimeter precise three-dimensional maps of these huge mines, which was previously very, very complicated to do and cost a lot more. I don't know how much of a believer I am in deliveries of coffee by drone. There's definitely some people that enjoy getting their coffee by a drone. I personally just prefer going to a coffee shop, but there's a market for everything. Hopefully we'll have some drone companies. DJI from China have participated at our events in the past, and perhaps they'll be here in February.
Thank you. There's a chap in a blue t-shirt, and then two at the back. Yes, just there.
Hi, my name is Yvonne. I'm a high schooler at Qatar Academy for Science and Technology. And my question was about Web3 and blockchain startups. What would you say their role is in the upcoming Web Summit?
Pay back their customers? No, there will absolutely be some speakers, in that space. We have had from 2012, maybe the earliest days of Web Summit, a dedicated crypto stage, bringing together some of those at the forefront of the crypto sector. At the start of the talk, I talked about the kind of the hype cycles that all of these technologies go through. Yeah. And so, crypto was last year's AI maybe, or something like that. It was blowing red hot, and then it just kind of went down into this deep valley. But that doesn't mean that there aren't still real applications and real significant kind of applications in the sector. But if you check on the, on the website, as the weeks get closer to the event, we're still nearly 5 months out, you'll see more and more speakers being announced, and you're going to see quite a number of speakers in that space. So hopefully we'll see you there in 4 or 5 months' time.
So stay tuned. Yeah. There was 2 questions at the back, right at the top, and then near.
So I would like to ask a question, specifically related to Tesla Autopilot. You mentioned that you don't trust driving Tesla Autopilot, like AI system. So, why specifically in this respect do you not trust it?
My God. Are you working for Elon? Well, I will say on motorways or highways it works quite well, but recently my wife comes from this very beautiful part of Ireland. It's on the northwest coast on the Atlantic, but it's also in a very isolated area. So some of the roads that you have to drive on, you would not believe that 2 cars can fit on the roads at the same time. And I just don't think the Tesla Autopilot knows what's happening. But if you've got a hack for it and want to come back to Ireland with me and try and help make it work, I'd love to do that. But thank you for your question. It was fantastic. Thank you.
I think on that convivial note, our time is drawing to a close. So thank you all so much for your questions. Obviously, we'd love to take more. I know I see a few hands up, and sorry that we couldn't get to you in time. I'd like to thank Paddy for coming here and speaking today. And also the Government Communications Office for collaborating with this talk. Thank you very much. I hope you have a great evening, and I'm sure I'll see many of you at Web Summit next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you.